Hi, everyone. Thank you for saving the best for last. I hope you're as rested as I am. I'll try to make this short and sweet so we can continue these discussions over dinner. So maybe to begin, I need to situate from where I'm speaking. So I'm Algerian born. I grew up in Algiers, then in France. And my experience is very much steeped in this transition from one world to another and from one type of power to another. And a very specific type of power balance, or should I say power imbalance, between these two worlds. And there was a seminal moment that I did not quite know at the moment, but in 2001, my life was about to change. I know it was the case for many of you, and I know there are some Americans with us today, but it was a moment where the place where I was living started implementing increasing restrictions on the visibility and the welcoming of my people. And I'd like to begin with this photo of Sebastião Salgado of the mines of Serra Pelada. So these are gold mines, and hundreds and thousands of bodies are involved in extracting the gold, extracting the resource. And every time I see this photo, what I see is actually the makings of architecture. And ever since I have been involved in this discipline, and I think all of us here are fully aware of this, based on the discussions that we've had all day, that we are by nature a discipline of extraction. There is a price to be paid, and this price goes towards the creation of value. But what value is it? And I believe that we are mostly involved in the creation of monetary value. And so we know that as architects, as we work for real estate developers, as we work for governments, for local powers, we are systematically putting ourselves in a position of serving a political agenda and serving a power that is in place. And the value that we are generating revolves around money. And so what kind of value exists outside of that? And is there another type of value that we can push forward in our architectural discourses in order to try and move towards a different type of production and a different type of existence? This photo was taken by Imani Jacqueline Brown. She's a Louisiana-based artist and researcher. And this is a really striking picture. So here what we see is what she calls a sacred grove. So here in the middle, we have the remnants of a burial ground of enslaved people in the plantations of Louisiana. This photo was taken in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, which means that this sacred grove has persisted and remains to this day. Around it, the plantation evolved, but it's still a productive landscape. These are agricultural lands, which means that what we see, what we witness is this dialogue, this contrast between a productive landscape and a non-productive one. So how is this staying up? And here I feel like we get a clue of maybe an alternative form of value. And the sacredness which is attached to this place only remains because of the taboo of death. This statue, the statute has a burial ground. It's okay, I can stay. I can pause a minute. And so this really brings to mind what kind of lessons we can take from this, from an architectural perspective. And then recently, Mohamed Meriem, who is an Algerian anthropologist, published this book, Des Empires sous la Terre. So the translation is underway, it should come out in March, look out for it. This literally means empires underground. And this work brings forward this idea that from a historical analysis, the idea that the emergence of extractive capitalism is based in part in the secularization. And so we move from this idea that the land holds life, invisible life, holds spirits, holds value, dragons, to a world where this land is dead. And if it doesn't have any life, then we are free to dig into it, to extract, and to exploit. And his work also mentions the, sorry, come on. Matthias, help me out. This doesn't work. And so in his book, he also mentions the colonial history and the displacement of body and merchandise and resources. And so the displacement of these bodies and the systems of value that accompany them. And this is where the next slide comes in. Wow. So I'm discovering that Germany is not quite what I expected.
I don't know what happened.
It's okay. I can keep talking, and then if we get some images, that's good. But at some point, I will need some slides. And so what Mohamed's work allowed us to do, I think, is bring in a theory that so far was completely absent from the discourses around extractivism, and kind of bring in this decolonial approach to ecology. So basically, this kind of forces us to also acknowledge the fact that this history of extractivism is also tied to the erasure of certain types of value and the sacredness of places and the types of ritual that existed around these places. So we're all aware of the role that indigenous populations have played in the safeguarding of land. In the United States, there was a lot of media attention around the Keystone Pipeline, and we have seen, to a certain extent, the success of people challenging the Trump administration in courts of law to prevent, or at least halter for a time, the construction of such pipeline. And these photos are actually collages by Marwan Barhouni that illustrate pictures taken from inside mosques in the UK. And here we kind of have this contrast between the traveling of these signifiers of meaning, these signifiers of a locale, of traditions, in contexts that are stand in stark contrast with them. And obviously these are adaptations of places. And Mathilde Cassani has done the same work on these sacred places in profane buildings. These photos were taken in New York. And what we're seeing is ground level spaces that have been more or less converted. Really what we see here is simply putting down carpets, but these signifiers of meaning and of sacredness that have been transported here. And so with this in mind, I'd like to take you very specifically to the context that I'm familiar with, Paris, for one project. I will only present one project that kind of summarizes the various challenges that we're facing when we're trying to deal with the sacred in secular societies and secular urban space. And so in 2019, I was approached to design a mosque in Paris. And the first thing that I did was to check how many mosques are present in Paris and what exactly is a mosque in France. So here you have, very roughly, the Google map of the mosques in Paris. And so when I looked at that, I was like, okay, there's a fair number of them. There's a few. But I couldn't quite remember any of them. I know one mosque in Paris, which is the Grande Mosquée de Paris, the biggest one. But I couldn't quite understand what these points were. And so when you zoom in, what you realize is that these are the mosques in question. And this, and sorry if you can't see it, it's normal, it's invisible. And so it's the ground, it's the ground space, it's the underground as well of these places. So the very word mosque here is used quite liberally. And so here what we can understand is the situation in this European capital with approximately 1 million practicing Muslims in the bigger Paris area. These are the types of spaces that are mostly available to them for worship. And here a little bit of context is necessary. France is a secular society. That means that the state does not fund sacred spaces. It's not going to fund a church. It's not going to fund a mosque. This is the theory. And then in reality, and this kind of brings us to this idea of contested monuments, the state has in place protection for monuments and patrimony. So what kinds of monuments do we find in France? You know it. So churches and sacred buildings. And so we kind of see these disproportionate and unbalanced treatment of the types of sacred events that are allowed to exist and take place within the city. And so here you have 3 examples of mosques that exist within Paris and the greater Paris area that are actual buildings. This one is the only one that's inside the confines of Paris, the traditional, in everyone's mind, what constitutes Paris. So behind the périphérique. And this is the Grande Mosquée of Paris. This was built between the 2 wars. This was built as an homage to the many Muslim fighters that were involved in the war against Germany, and that died for France. And so there was this idea, since all these populations were based in French colonies, that this building would be an homage to the indigenous populations from these places. So when you look at this building, what do you see? Do you see a French building? Do you see a Parisian building? Where is this based? And so this was a neo-Mauresque building that used architectural elements from Morocco, from Tunisia, so from local expressions of architecture from these French colonies. And this solidifies the notion that a mosque is foreign and alien to that land. It is an alien architecture for an alien people. And these 2 other examples are more contemporary. But here what we see is still an attempt to reproduce certain types of elements. So we have the dome, we have the minarets, and we have sort of the arches and kind of a reinterpretation of Arabic and Andalusian elements on the facade. And these attempts to sort of recreate a certain idea of what a mosque is, meaning that it's necessarily something that is tied, then again, to very specific geographical type of architecture, maintains that idea, maintains the idea that it's still diluted, pastiched form of identity that only exists within the fringes of the French society. So what do we do with that? Because these are the only examples of mosques that we have in France. And being tasked with designing a new one forced us into double bind. One, this is not simply because the French are the bad guys and that they impose this type of aesthetic. This is also a signifier of the histories of populations, of part of the populations, that want to maintain a form of tie to ancestral lands, that also bought into a certain discourse of their position, but also of the type of architecture that represented them. And then the second one was that towards local power and dominant power, we knew we were in for a ride. And we can think about that for a while. Sit with the discomfort. And so maybe to continue on this idea, I should clarify exactly what our client asked us. So our client is a French association. These are descendants of first-wave immigrants that came from North Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, around the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, subsequent waves of migration, and especially right after the Second World War, to build France, to build the roads, to work in the factories. And they settled there and they had children, and their children had children. And they're French, and they certainly, most of them hold a single citizenship. And so their requirement is for us to design a French mosque, which is a complex program to be tasked with. And so beyond the French mosque that they're asking us to accomplish, they're also asking us to do something that functions economically. Who is going to pay for this? They're not able to afford this full building, and the state won't fund a religious building. So we find ourselves in a position where we actually need to make a sacred space that also operates as like a financially stable building, something that generates income, something that generates money, something that's going to be able to sustain itself in time. But we're not going from nothing, so this is the current building that exists. This little building is actually a former factory, a paper factory in the center of Paris, that was bought 50 years ago by the grandfather of the current president of the association. And this is their most valuable heritage. They bought it for nothing. Now its value has skyrocketed with the increase of real estate of Paris. So we also have a land that's actually being looked at by real estate developers who are courting them regularly. In 2014, this photo was taken outside of the mosque. So as I've mentioned before, we have very little prayer spaces for the number of Muslims in Paris. So these are the types of situations that we have witnessed in the city from time to time. People praying outside on the street. So if any of you has ever been to Paris and has seen the state of the sidewalks, you know that you don't want to put your face down there. And so you know that this is not something that people do for fun or because they particularly enjoy it. And so the response was for the police to now be present every Friday outside of this building. And here is an example of police presence around a Friday noon prayer time that makes sure that we have no more street prayers. The question for the need for space is not addressed, but this is what we're here for. And so here is maybe just a quick breakdown on who is involved, because we believe in transparency for these types of projects. And so on the side of the design team, we are working with SBP Engineering, which is actually a German firm. Surprisingly, they were one of the rare firms that accepted working with us on this topic. We actually had a number of offices that refused to work on a mosque project in France. But the speciality of this office is that they're really good at structural engineering, obviously, but also at making covers. And you will understand later on why this is so important for this project. And also, we had, beyond our client, we had an assistant to the client, which is actually an association of young Muslims based in that neighborhood that were working hard to make sure that the future of this mosque is meant for them and not for their grandparents, which is kind of the issue today. And so the way we started was to set everyone down and accept the fact that we would have to spend a year just talking. And so that's what we proceeded to do. And we spent a year trying to understand exactly what were the expectations. What were the expectations of the client, but also the expectations of the people who wanted to attend this building, but that we also hoped we'd be present and make this building alive. We know that there's a generational gap. There's also a gap in expectations and desires. And here, what was interesting is that what these people wanted was not tied to form. So no one mentioned the necessity for a certain type of architecture, but certain needs were extremely clear. The need for a feeling of community, the presence of nature, the quality of bathrooms, having cleanliness, having light, having comfort, and also having spaces of quality for the women attending the mosque. As a side note, since everyone is praying in the underground, I'll let you imagine the state of the spaces for the women. So we got to the drawing board going back to the most essential form of a mosque, and kind of historically, what does that mean? What are the requirements that we need to meet as designers to make this building a mosque? And it kind of bottled down to three things. One is a delimitation. So it is a clean space, a sacred space, a sacralized space, in opposition to a profane one. So it's simply a delimitation. The second one is direction. We all know you have to pray towards Mecca. And then the third one is the capacity for collectivity. You can pray on your own, on your carpet, but for it to be a mosque, you actually need to be able to pray as a community. So this photo is taken of what we call the desert mosques. So these are Bedouin, temporary, and migrant mosques that can erect pretty much anywhere in the desert. And we find all of these qualities and these characteristics present here. The problem is we're in Paris, and we don't have that much space. But also we can't really use the ground that much. So verticality kind of comes in. And we realized that the issue is going to be a technical one. And so we spent the next 6 months working on the technical aspects of this. So as you might have noticed, for a sacred space, we're not spending that much time talking about light or the sacred nature of the spaces or the quality of the spaces. So much time is just spent on defining program and then defining the technical aspects that are required for this program to happen. So here we have a building that functions with multiple stairs that make each floor individually accessible, independently from one another, meaning that you can actually cohabitate with profane spaces and sacred spaces at the same time. It also means that you can have various things happening simultaneously, but you also can have different types of people inhabit that space. And by that I mean that this can be fully inhabited by women, or fully inhabited by men, or half, or 2/3, or 1/4, etc. some more technical stuff. So basically, this whole process of getting from one sacred to non-sacred space and vice versa is through the state of our bodies. And so Muslims go through a process of cleansing that body. So from the bustle of the city to the moment you put down your body on the ground, you have gone through stages where you removed your shoes, you have cleaned your body, and you potentially have dressed differently in order to pray. And so the whole building needs to operate in a way that allows for this transition and these thresholds to take place throughout the whole thing. The way this whole thing is designed is so far very much technical. And so at some point we were like, okay, now that we have solved these issues, we need to look to the uncomfortable thing for us, which is, what does it look like? And how do we solve this issue of, okay, we put to the side all the aesthetics and the expectations of what the mosque needs to look like, but we need to build. After deconstructing these ideas, what do we build from? And so we chose to pick two fundamental things. One is something that comes from the sacred texts. And so here we took this description of God that is put in the text, nur ala nur, which means light upon light. And we're like, light is an architectural element. We can work with that. And the second aspect is time. Time and the movement of bodies through time and the rituals that take place. So here you have a calendar very much tied to the moon of the rituals for Islamic practice. Are you familiar with it? So how many times do you need to pray? 5, yeah, 5 times a day. And then you have once a week where there's a congregation. And then obviously you have the big events throughout the year, Ramadan, and the various celebrations of that faith. But that meant that within one day, we have 5 times a day the potential for people to come in, come out, pray. And this movement, the generation of that movement for us was fundamental and was the sacred characteristic of that building. And so here's the basic design and basic concept for that building. We thought this needs to operate in 2 various ways. One, needs to be able to provide intimacy while reflecting light. And second, it needs to be able to emit light. And it needs to move. We know that we are in a context where this building needs to be invisible. So light is both a quality that needs to be acquired inside the building, but it also needs to be part of what makes this building visible within the space where it is rejected. And so we looked at textile because of how tied it is to the practice, obviously with the carpets being the basic form of religious worship, but also the potential for it to provide that movement. And so we decided to use this textile both for the envelope of the building, but also for getting rid of any type of wall inside. So instead of walls, we would have these curtains that allow us to change the type of occupation of that space, whether it's being used for prayer or whether it's being used as a profane space. And here is one image of the project. And what we can see here are these 2 massive metal chain curtains around it with 1 silver and 1 gold anchor around it. And actually we entered discussions with various religious communities of the neighborhood because this is not the kind of project that happens just with the Muslim community. It happens if everyone is involved in it and pushes for its inception. And interestingly, when we discussed it with the Jewish leaders of that neighborhood, they told us about the symbolism between gold and silver. And I hope I don't mix both up, but gold being the prayer, that you give to God, and silver being the gift that you receive. And interestingly, they gave us another layer to the choices that were made in the nature of the project. And that's where our fantastic German engineers came into play with that mobile metallic mesh facade. The issue here, obviously, being that this has never been done as a mobile facade. We have examples of it as a static element or as smaller curtains. But here, for these 8 meters high curtains, this is obviously also a technical innovation. And the idea here is to have this building that behaves in various ways and behaves with these layers of intimacy and light. And so here we have just a quick drawing to sort of compare. If we have full prayer on one side, what do? We close up the curtains because we want intimacy, but we open up the curtains that are on the wall because we want sound to travel. And then if we want to have classes or sports events or all types of things that require maybe a different type of partitioning, we will open up the curtains inside, muffling the sound against the wall and opening those on the facade. And all of this being able to know variations depending on the use. I'm almost done. How am I on time? Am I good? Perfect. So these are the last 5 minutes. So the title of this talk, because I gave it a title to try and make it make sense, but from worship to guardianship, tries to reference how we attempt to reposition human bodies at the scale of the building. So in the example that I gave you of the project that we're working on, anyone can open and close the curtains, whether they're outside or inside, making each individual body, woman and man, children, able to interact and impact how this building behaves. And this doesn't come from anywhere. This is very much steeped in this tradition of maintenance, of care, that is so deeply tied to anything sacred. This photo is taken in Djenné, in Mali. This is a 100-year-old mosque. It's built out of earth, so it doesn't hold that well, but it's still up after 100 years. And the reason for that is that every year we have a ceremony of plastering. And the plastering of it requires every single member of the community to be involved. That means the kids are involved, women, men, elderly. The elderly are here to bitch about it and tell them how to do it better, but they're still there and they're sort of getting involved in the process. And it's just a beautiful testimony to the maintenance also of the sacredness of place through collective action, through an action of care, sanctuarization. And I hope that if we can take something away from today, I have a duty, which is to see this through. But I think collectively we also have one to make sure that these are the types of practices that we push forward, that you need to all be my allies in doing so.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Meriem. So, where are the questions?
I was curious how you're dealing with the call to prayer on Fridays.
We can't have any calls to prayer in public space in France. It's not possible. I know that New York very recently allowed that. I saw it on Instagram, saw the first call to prayer. It's beautiful. But it's not possible in France, and that's also the reason why a minaret has no meaning and no destination, no need. It's like a dead limb that you need to cut off to grow something stronger and more efficient. And I feel like architecture is a signifier of these things. What is the political climate? What is the role and the place of that type of worship in public space? Obviously, historically, you have religious buildings that are generally the highest buildings in a skyline. That has changed in recent years. But historically, that's kind of something that signifies its place in the hierarchy, in the urban hierarchy. Here we know that we're very low in that hierarchy, and we kind of need to make sure that the building is both a shape-shifter, a hidden yet extremely visible. And that's the call for prayer. It's the curtains opening and closing.
Thank you very much, Meriem. That was beautiful and moving. I have a question of how do you deal first with the latent Islamophobia in France, and what does it mean to build a community building in a certain way in a hostile environment?
So it means very concrete things. One of them being that a year after we started working on this project, a new law was put in place that created even more restrictions on mosque buildings, especially on the control. Everything is about control. The control over financing, the control over who gets to create these buildings. And the mosque, the current mosque that we're working with, received an impromptu visit from the police during a math class that was being given to kids without the presence of their parents or authorization of these parents, the questioning of these children. So we could feel the tension, and we could feel the responsibility that kind of came with creating a safe home, both for these children, their parents, and all of their community. So there's no easy answer. I think we already know the answer. It's the situation that we're all dealing with. So battling from an uncomfortable position, from an unfavorable power position. But interestingly enough, recently I was reading a history of cancer, so nothing to do with this, but it was this overview sort of something that seems so scientific and objective as disease and the study of disease, and all of the hurdles that one has to go through and that we as a species had to go through to move forward in the study and the betterment of treatment for political reasons, for social reasons. But also this thread of how advocacy and how courage does pay. And we might not live to see it, but it does pay in the long run. And that's something that I truly believe, and that's what sustains this type of work. I hope this is going to come out. It might come out in 10 years. We're going to put down the permits next month, but I don't know if that's going to work. But I know that it's my duty to do so.
So I have a very practical question. I'd be interested in what building materials you chose, what sustainability and material culture, how they influenced your choices, and also what kind of a heating system you have.
Wow. No, we have answers to these questions. So surprisingly enough, it's a fully, it's wood structure for the whole building. But we had to hide it. So the thing is, both for fire regulations being extremely strict in France, if you use wood for this size of building, especially for this type of program, you need to enclose it, to protect it. So we're not going to have a wood aesthetic for the building. And the second reason was actually every time we try to talk about wood architecture to our clients, they're like, oh, but it's going to burn down, it's very dangerous. And so we also kind of snuck in the wooden structure. He's aware of it, kind of. I mean, I talk about my client. But he doesn't he doesn't need to know all these details. We're just trying to make sure that the building has the most sustainable agenda possible. But we have one big issue with this aspect of sustainability, which is that we want a transparent building. And if you want transparency, you have glass or you have plastic. I prefer plastic, glass to plastic actually in this case, but we're like actually merging it with metal panels, reflective metal panels, to deal with reflecting sunlight and trying to make this as thermal effective as possible. But we're also using the curtain system to try and create a moucharabieh effect on these facades. So this is actually both a complex issue, because initially this building, when we first designed it, it was all in stone, very closed off. We wanted it to be a monument. But it felt wrong in that context to hide away. And it felt like it was necessarily to design a building that says that we have nothing to hide. And for the heating system, we have a, I don't know how you say it in English, une pompe à chaleur. You have like a thermal heat system. Yeah, exactly. Heat pump. Yeah, there.
So I think the project is really quite extraordinary. It's very beautiful. I had a question going back to almost the beginning of your explaining it as working with a slightly younger group, and also your analysis of these buildings that were kind of symbols of what we assume, sort of pseudo-African or pseudo-Islamic. And I wondered if you actually engaged anyone who dealt with other religious structures, which also deal with similar things of how do you do a contemporary religious building of any kind without going kitsch, frankly.
Absolutely. I think most of the references that we looked at actually were churches, because Christianity has a much longer and richer contemporary history of modernizing and addressing how the religious can take place with contemporary buildings, with things that make sense today. So these were actually a lot of the references that we looked at. And then also to frame it, I was educated in France. So even my architectural curriculum, the canon that I'm familiar with, is that one. And so I think the work that we had to do was, like basically you do 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And I think our first 2 steps forward were, we're going to also do like a very modern reinterpretation of what a mosque is, and it's going to be very cute, and like we had all of these very monumental, beautiful images of sacred spaces in mind. I love cathedrals, like I love, high ceilings and places with, humph, But we couldn't, and then gradually we realized that we were, not going to be able to do this technically. The urban regulations make it impossible to make, we're not going to do like a 50-meter high building just to have these massive ceiling heights. But also, it was a history lesson of trying to understand what was a mosque originally. We found the work of Michael Badou, who's Nigerian-born, British-based architect, who did this work of trying to understand what was a mosque. And he gives this beautiful example of the very first mosque was an enclosure using palm tree trunks. It was just like a rectangle. There's no dome. It's out in the air. And there's just like an enclosure, and everything is out. And it's mud on the floor, so it's not super efficient. But anyway, so this is the history of it. And then what we see is that it's actually Orthodox churches, those domes that we now associate with mosques, because we think of the Ottoman architecture that has been so influential. They actually originate from Orthodox Christianity and the beautiful buildings that were built for this religion. And so there is a cooptation and reinterpretation, a cross-pollination of architectural and constructive cultures. This is the point of our discipline as well. And I hope that this, in its small way, can contribute to this idea that sacred spaces are also a place for innovation and trying to move at least a little step forward.
Thank you very much, Meriem.